Today is a great day for people like me and fans of Joe Abercrombie's writing because it's the official release of The Devils in the US, which kicks off a new series in a new fantasy world. And while I've talked a ton about Joe Abercrombie's work before on here in pieces, today we're going to do something more all-encompassing. Essentially, I'm going to create a Joe Abercrombie reading guide. So we'll answer questions like, what can I expect from his writing? In what order should I read his works? Because that is one that trips people up a lot. I'll also give a brief talk on what each of those books is about. We'll get into how his writing style has evolved and matured and what initial weaknesses were improved on over time. And finally, I'll do my first law world ranking, and we'll talk about how The Devils is both similar and different from his first law world books. And since I'm going to be ranking these, I'd love to know in the comments what your favorite Joe Abercrombie book is, whether you've read them all or not. So go ahead and comment away. I appreciate that. Now, I've already read The Devils because I got an early NetGalley digital advanced reader copy. I read it on my phone on vacation with the family at Disney late last year. But starting today, I am rereading it with the Fantasy Sickos Book Club, which is part of the Sickos Bindery community. Essentially, you sub to the Bindery community at the Sicko or Mega Sicko tier. You hop into Discord, and all the member channels are unlocked from there. And that's where we discuss all of our thoughts on it as we read it together. This is just one of the benefits of joining our community, but I'll leave it there since that's the most relevant part of the topic at hand. Make sure to go check out all the other things I got going on with my short form platforms, my wife's Etsy shop. All that is linked in my link tree and in the description. And as always, likes, subs, ringing the bell, aggressively sharing this with friends and family against their will is very much appreciated. So we'll start with who is Joe Abercrombie? Why am I and so many others obsessed with him and his work? What's the style? What's the vibe of the books? The basics is he's a British fantasy author. He studied psychology in college, which plays a major role in his writing. He's a man after my own heart when it comes to his video game taste, as he's mentioned love for games like Civilization, Red Dead Redemption, and he's, in my opinion, the best Grimdark author in the game right now. And Grimdark is usually characterized by bleak subject matter and a through line of futility. The characters are morally gray. The style is gritty. It's a subgenre that really clicks with me when done right. Think like a Game of Thrones, right? Where no character is safe, everyone has their flaws, everything is usually screwed, that kind of thing. So you're not going to get like this cookie cutter hero's journey, epic fantasy style that permeated the fantasy genre for decades. You're going to get a group of assholes that are usually out for themselves, just trying to make it in this messed up world they've been dropped into. And you're going to love to hate some of them, and you're going to hate to love others. And again, this is where Abercrombie's background in psychology is such a driving force behind his success, because his character work is at the tippity top of the mountain. You really get inside of their head, and you may not agree with them, but you at least understand their twisted motivations. And for me, it's so much fun unpacking the psychological profile of each character. And as a character-driven reader that prefers third-person limited, his style works perfectly for me because I really do think like that the complex and fascinating POVs can save a bad plot and not the other way around. For the rest of it, you are going to get some epic battle scenes with some unique techniques that make those stand out. It's going to be bloody. It's going to have some dark humor, but there's also going to be some incredibly profound lines that make you think. He's constantly surprising me with all of those elements, and he's constantly subverting fantasy tropes, which I very much appreciate because none of it feels cliche. And as far as like the magic goes, because it is fantasy, you're not going to get like a Brandon Sanderson style where everything has checks and balances and it's all mapped out and explained in painstaking detail. Sometimes people have certain abilities, and that's just kind of what it is. The magic doesn't drive the story, which I actually prefer. It's just utilized at key points to add some flair to it, and it creates these extra layers of dilemma, if that makes sense. And I'm going to continue talking about his style as we work through this, but a question I get a lot is, where do I start with his work? Now, there's three potential answers to this. The first is a trilogy that he wrote geared towards young to new adults. That's the Shattered Sea series. I personally have not read this yet because I go to Abercrombie for the unfiltered rawness, right? I don't go to the Joe Abercrombie bowling alley with the intention of putting the bumpers up And I'm kind of saving those for when like I've done all the rereads and I'm really desperate to read his work again. So I'm already failing you as a guide here, but I did want to note that. Now, forever, the answer to that question has been The Blade itself, which is book 1 in the First Law world, which has 2 trilogies, 3 standalones, and a short story collection, and also another short story collection as well. It's massive. I'll explain all that later. It's massive. And if you read a later one in that world first, you're going to get some kind of spoiler for the previous books. And we'll go through that order in a minute. But if you're going to read anything from the First Law world, my heavy recommendation is that you start with The Blade itself. The problem with this is that it's his debut. He hasn't quite honed in on his craft where he knows what his strengths are and like how to highlight them and what weaknesses to hide or improve upon. So while I was hooked from the second or third chapter and immediately bought the rest of the initial trilogy, I understand it has some holes in it. For example, the pacing in the first book, and there's also a lack of a major plot in this book. Now, this series has a major plot overall, and this book has subplots, but the major plot really isn't revealed until about midway into the second book for reasons that you'll understand if you read it or if you've read it. There's also his work regarding women characters, which was a weakness of his throughout these first 3 books, and he himself chalked this up to bad writing, and he worked really doggone hard to fix that, which by all accounts he did in the later books, producing some of my favorite female main characters that I have ever read. That said, you're still going to know if you vibe with his overall style pretty quickly in this, even if it doesn't blow your mind. So it's still a quality litmus test. Now, this is where The Devils comes in, which is his newest work just released, and this kicks off a new trilogy. And from my understanding, how this trilogy is going to work is it's essentially going to be 3 standalones that share the same universe. And much like his First Law standalones, you'll get some bleed through with characters that have been previously introduced. My March 20th book haul video on here goes into detail about this book, where I also talk about how advanced reader copies work, so I'll keep it brief here. But the basic setup is this is set in an alternate medieval Europe. We follow Brother Diaz as he's assigned to lead a motley crew known as the Devils across the land to deliver an unlikely empress to her throne. It works as an introduction to Abercrombie's work because he's evolved so much as a writer since The Blade itself 2 decades ago. The plot is apparent from the get-go, the pacing is better, and this is the most fun book that Abercrombie has written. Like, he really leans into the comedy and the over-the-top elements with various creatures and monsters. It's just a super fun ride, but it still has all the trademarks of a typical Abercrombie book. And if you're not wanting to jump into an unfinished trilogy because this is going to be a trilogy, I get that. But again, I want to flag that this trilogy will work more as like 3 interconnected standalones. So it's all taking place in the same world. You'll get some bleed through with the plot threads and characters, but they will work on their own, I think, anyway. I can't be positive because the second book's not out yet, but that's what I think. Also, I don't think we have to worry about Abercrombie pulling a George because he's already proven that he can finish what he starts. Now, with that said, if The Devils hooks you and you want more, or if you want to start with The Blade itself, let's discuss the reading order of the First Law world. You're going to start with the First Law trilogy, The Blade itself, Before They Are Hanged, The Last Argument of Kings. The setup here is you've got this war-torn world that's hanging on by a thread. It takes place in like this circular world, which you're going to want to Google the map because it's not included in the book for some reason. There's a war in the north with, well, the north. And there's a rebellion to the south with the Gurkles. And you've got this group of deeply flawed individuals that are swept up in this. This introduces my favorite character of all time, Sandan Glokta, who is a crippled torturer for the Inquisition. Abercrombie making him into a weirdly fascinating character is just world-class stuff. And it was after Glokta's first POV chapter that I knew I was like home, like this was for me. After that, you're going to transition to what's called The Great Leveler, which is 3 standalones that are connected to this world, taking place at different points in the world, with some bleed through again, with the characters, just like how the Devil's trilogy is planned out. And a note that this is all happening chronologically. Each full-length book happens in order on the timeline with the publication date. First up is Best Served Cold. This is a revenge story There's been a potential of this being made into a film starring Rebecca Ferguson, but that's been in the works for forever, so I'm still holding out hope. Anyway, best served cold rocks. And then you have the heroes, which is essentially a battle that takes place over 3 days. They're fighting over a pretty insignificant piece of land. This is where Abercrombie introduces his past the POV baton style war scenes, and it's some of the best battle action that you will ever read. And then finally you have Red Country, which is a Western that's like this mix of Lonesome Dove and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This explores how civilization expands and the cost of that. It's also like a revenge and redemption story. It has one of the best reveals in all of the books. This was very good. All right, so this is where the short story collection Sharp Ends comes in. This isn't strictly required, but damn, it's a good time. And I loved a couple of the new main characters introduced. And I know the sort of like origin stories for a couple of the initial First Law trilogy characters are beloved by the base. So I would still recommend reading this. Now you're getting into the bookend trilogy, which is called The Age of Madness. You have A Little Hatred, next is The Trouble with Peace, and finally The Wisdom of Crowds. This takes place 30 years after the events in the First Law trilogy and 15 years after the events of Red Country, so there's a significant time skip. And these new characters are dealing with the consequences of the previous generation's choices, and there's a new challenge to deal with as their world is undergoing an industrial revolution and all the challenges that come with that. This introduces 2 characters from the new generation that are 2 of my favorites, not just in this universe, but like fantasy at large, which is a good time to note that if you're worried about like the new characters, that they're not going to hook you after the first trilogy, don't. I would argue that when you look at the collective, the most compelling characters are actually introduced in the later books, in my opinion anyway. And I haven't gotten to this one yet because I'm saving it for when I'm super desperate for new Abercrombie, but there's also a novella-length short story collection attached to The Age of Madness called The Great Change and Other Lies, so I wanted to make sure to note that. So now that we know the order, I'm going to work through how I'd rank all 9 of the full-length books, and as tough as it is, and no ranking can really be right or wrong. It's very subject to change. I do feel like I have a pretty good grasp on them as I've reread the first 6 books and the short story collection. But it could still change from day to day, though. On the bottom of the pile is The Blade itself, even though it still holds a special place in my heart, as this is the book that got me hooked. Then 8th is Red Country, which is probably the most polarizing standalone of the bunch. 7th is Before They Are Hanged, which is the second book in the initial trilogy. I will say, though, that this ending had me cackling. I love this. 6th for me is Best Served Cold, which a lot of people have as their favorite standalone. My only gripe with this is that it lost a little bit of steam at the end, but it's still a fantastic time. And number 5 is The Wisdom of Crowds, the final book in the world. 4th is The Heroes. Again, another polarizing one. Usually people that love The Heroes have Red Country lower, and people that loved Red Country have The Heroes lower. So it depends on your taste. That also marks like how impressive it is that these books are so different while still being in the same world and the different themes they explore. Anyway, yeah. 4th for The Heroes. 3rd is A Little Hatred, which fixed all of the book 1 issues with the Blade itself. Did a fantastic job resetting the table, establishing the plot. The pacing is fantastic. This was amazing. At 2nd is The Last Argument of Kings, the final book in the initial trilogy. So much happens in this book. It is a wild ride. And at the top of the mountain is The Trouble with Peace, which is, in my opinion, the perfect fantasy book. It is everything I love about the genre. It's Abercrombie at his absolute peak. And again, I'd love to know your favorite one in the comments. And if you want to take the time to rank them like I did, go for it. I'd love to talk about it. All right, I have one final tip in this guide, and that is, if you're really wanting to level up your experience with these books, immersion reading is the way to go. That means reading the physical book while listening to the audio. That helps comprehension, but the reason for that is the narrator, the GOAT, Stephen Pacey, who worked on all the First Law books and the Devils. He's brilliant. His character work is out of this world. And it's like the little things with him, like with Sandang Glokta, our beloved crippled torturer, who has a lisp when he speaks because his teeth are all mangled and broken and knocked out, but his inner monologue doesn't have that lisp. And I was so hooked on that character that I started to think in Pacey's delivery of him in my thoughts. In fact, when I was reading The Devils, I was constantly asking myself, how would Pacey deliver this line or do this character voice, which I finally get to find out today. And I'm getting those answers today already. I've already started it. So yeah, either adding the audiobook or even going pure audiobook is the way to go with Abercrombie's work. And that's it. My comprehensive Joe Abercrombie reading guide. I hope you enjoyed the ride and got something from this. I appreciate y'all hanging out, and I'll see you on the next one.